Spider-Man has a ton of really fantastic villains in his rogues gallery, and in today's video we ask the question, what if he had even more amazing villains? And what if these new villains were variations on existing video game characters? And yeah, not a complicated explanation for today's video, so let's get into it, shall we? Let's go.
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show.
Nicholas Anks hadn't grown up around the best influences. He'd spent much of his early years surrounded by members of New York's notorious Echidna gang. They weren't the most well-known of criminal groups in the city, but they did have one significant advantage over a lot of the other gangs: the Master Emerald. That was the name they'd given to a gemstone that had been left on Earth after the Chitauri invasion that had been recovered by members of the group. Not only could it rapidly charge any of the gang's impressive weaponry in seconds, but holding the gem for an hour or so could give you super strength and speed, for a short period of time. Many gangs, and even some heroes, had tried to take the emerald from the echidnas, but they'd always been thwarted, often by Nicholas himself. See, in Nicholas's teen years, well, he'd wanted to go out on jobs with older members of the gang. Because of his age, they'd kept him behind, and made it his job to guard the gemstone. He spent much of his time in the room with it, holding it, playing with it, napping, or just sparring a punching bag that was also kept in the room. After a couple years of regular guard duty, Nicholas found that consistent contact with the emerald had made the strength and speed he gained from it permanent. This, paired with a set of spiked gauntlets he wore on his forearm that thrust out on impact, meant that he had devastating punches that could take out almost any opponent in a single hit. But it didn't do him much good on the day the emerald was finally stolen. Nicholas had quickly run out to the washroom one day while on guard duty, and when he returned to the room, it was filling up with smoke. He tried to rush over to where the gem should have been, blindly feeling around the room, but he found nothing. By the time the smoke had cleared, the emerald was gone, and in its place was a note that read, "I'll be keeping this in safer hands, courtesy of your friendly neighborhood, Spider-Man." Furiously, Nicholas set off to hunt down the spider to return his gang's property. After a few hours of searching around New York, hoping Spidey would pop up in the news or mentions of him on social media swinging around, Nicholas finally decided to lure him out. He donned a costume to conceal at least part of his identity and give him some extra protection from gunfire if police got to him first, then stormed into Times Square and started smashing cars. He was avoiding hurting any civilians, but he was obliterating anything he could with his tech and emerald-enhanced strength. He called for Spider-Man to come face him, and eventually, word must have gotten to the wall crawler because he did indeed appear on the scene. Nicholas could have done devastating damage to the spider if he'd been able to hit him, but Spider-Man's speed wasn't making that easy. All the same, Nicholas kept swinging and yelling at Spidey to return the emerald, but he had no idea what Nicholas was talking about. Nicholas finally got a hit on Spidey and practically knocked him out with one blow, sending him smashing right through a bus. After that, Spidey stopped messing around and webbed Nicholas up from afar. While Nicholas was being processed by the police, Spidey investigated what he'd been talking about. After some time, Spidey would find out that the gemstone had actually been stolen by New York's kingpin of crime, Wilson Fisk, who had planted the note to frame Spidey for the theft. Not that it mattered much in the end. Spidey had no intention of returning the gem to the Echidna gang, if he could even get it away from Fisk. Nicholas could have ended up in jail for a long time after what he'd done, but he was promptly sprung free by his gang, who was incredibly proud of him for going toe-to-toe with Spider-Man. They made him a leading member of the group, and they started planning what they could do next time to make sure that when Nicholas went up against the wall crawler again, he'd come out on top. Poppy was very hardworking from an early age. She was an orphan who craved attention and had big ambitions of being wealthy and successful. In her early teens, she found that she had a natural gift for sleight of hand and showmanship that made her very entertaining to watch. She started making money performing magic tricks at children's birthday parties and got a real taste for even the limited amount of spotlight she had. So she spent much of her spare time learning better and better tricks. For a few years, she was slowly able to raise the price of her shows more and more as she built up her name as a children's entertainer. But she was still fairly small time. Eventually, she found there was a cap of what parents were willing to spend for a performer at their kid's birthday, and she realized she needed to up her game. She needed something that would make her stand out against all other magicians and showmen in the city. Eventually, she figured, why not try real magic? Like many people in New York, she was well aware that Dr. Strange had his prime residence in the city, his sanctum sanctorum. At first, she tried setting up a meeting with him, but he wasn't an easy person to get in contact with. So eventually, she decided to try a different approach. She kept a keen eye on the news from around the world, waiting for something live to show Strange appearing in. After weeks of waiting, she found a day where Strange was facing some kind of tentacle monster on the news over in Japan, and she broke in to the sanctum. For a few moments, she searched through his libraries and artifacts for anything she could use to grant herself some magical abilities, but she didn't end up with much time to look. Spider-Man had been flagged to a break-in at the sanctum and showed up to find Poppy inside searching around. He should have been able to apprehend her easily, but she was able to evade him in Strange's artifact room, as she hurled items at Spidey that he'd have to catch to keep from breaking. Eventually, she smashed her arm through a glass case holding an ugly, blue, furry doll. She grabbed it and was about to toss it when a chill shot up her arm from the toy. Its bulbous pink lips suddenly opened wide and let out an eerie shriek. Poppy and the doll both suddenly melted into a puddle of goop that then shriveled and disappeared. Upon returning and being told the story, Strange would explain to Spider-Man that the doll was the only gateway to a pocket dimension containing a monstrous demon. He claimed that the girl's fate was now sealed, but that didn't turn out to be quite true. Poppy was trapped in the dimension with a gangly, fluffy demon with rows of jagged teeth and big, eerie eyes. But on a whim, she tried doing some of her tricks for it, and the beast was enamored. She and the creature eventually became friends, and the monstrosity ended up being able to imbue Poppy with the magical abilities of his dark realm. But they did come at the cost of her sanity. After a few months, she'd finally learned enough magic to open a gateway home, and better still, she'd figured out how to summon the demon to her side whenever she needed. Back in her home world, with her new abilities and newly fractured mind, she changed her sights from performing for paying crowds to pulling off elaborate, flashy heists using her incredible magic. Soon after, Spider-Man would show up at one of her widely publicized crimes, and she'd be manically eager to have another bout with him. She summoned her demon friend, and together the two would eventually best the spider and escape. But his arrival had been a massive thrill. Poppy loved the added challenge of defeating Spider-Man to complete her crimes, and found the event much more widely publicized because of his appearance. From then on, she'd commit crimes specifically with the intention of Spider-Man showing up to try and stop her, so she and her demonic ally could get more and more time in the spotlight. Lester Rath had always been a loner. He didn't like being around other people, so much so that he didn't even want to have a job. He almost always just wanted to stay home in the top floor apartment he'd inherited from his family. But he still needed money. Eventually, in a stroke of luck, he'd meet a genetics scientist in need of a willing test subject. The doctor's work wasn't exactly legal, so he was willing to pay good money for a subject that wouldn't tell people about it and wouldn't ask many questions. The gene-altering experiments would be once a week for less than an hour, where Lester would simply have to sit in a room by himself and undergo various radiation experiments. That seemed like a perfect setup for Lester, until the experiments started to work. First, Rath's skin would start to change color and grow rough and spiky. Then he'd start sprouting a tail and wings, and even poisonous bones from his forearms. None of this fazed Lester, as he couldn't care less about how he looked or the abilities he was gaining, but on his walks back home from the lab, people started to notice. Eventually, authorities caught wind of the experiments and of Rath. The doctor went into hiding, and soon enough, S.H.I.E.L.D. agents came knocking on Lester's door. He refused to let them in and told them how he looked and what he did was none of their business. They tried to insist politely, but Wrath, being very short-tempered and not liking others in his home, tried to slam the door on them. When one of the agents held it open, he punched them, and the poisonous spike jutting from his forearm stabbed into them. The other agents attacked and Wrath cut loose. With his tail, he slammed them through a neighbor's wall, making sure not to damage his own home. When an agent shot at him, the bullets bounced off his scaly skin and embedded in the walls and floor. This enraged Wrath. The anger seemed to pump through his body and massively increase his strength. He grabbed the agent, shot into the hall, smashed through the window, and flew the agent up and up and up. When he was higher than the highest buildings, Lester dropped the agent and just watched him fall. But he could also see, swinging down the street, was Spider-Man. Spidey got to the agent just as he was passing the rooftops. He maneuvered as best he could to catch the agent and not hurt him, but as he caught the man, Spidey tumbled with him through the air and crashed straight through the window of Wrath's apartment. Spidey and the agent were both fine, but burning rage exploded even more through Lester, who soared down into his battered apartment. As he yelled angrily at Spidey, a burst of flames exploded from his mouth and shot at the wall crawler, who barely ducked under it. That lit the apartment on fire and further enraged Wrath, who blamed Spider-Man for the incident. He smashed the wall crawler with his tail and they took the fight into the city sky. Wrath hurled Spidey through buildings, burning him and poisoning him. Things were looking dire for the wall crawler until he was able to get Wrath close to the ground. With all the webbing he had, Spidey webbed the villain down and blocked his mouth to prevent more flames. Wrath was taken in by S.H.I.E.L.D. for now, but he'd someday escape and forever despise S.H.I.E.L.D. and Spidey for taking him from his precious home. Many unusual aliens have visited Earth over the years, but few more strange-looking than a couple Mugulons from the planet Inquilon 5. Cuppy and Muggs were brothers, who never shied away from a risky situation, which had gotten them into some serious trouble on Nowhere, the mining colony of Exitar. At a shady casino there, they'd been on a hot streak, winning enough credits to catch the attention of the lead backer of the casino, the head of the group who ran Nowhere, the Collector himself, Tannelier Tavon. The Collector decided to join in the fun and made a deal with the two unusual alien brothers. See, he had a massive collection of creatures and beings from all across the galaxy in his gallery, but he didn't have any beings from Inquilon 5. He made a deal that if they got a winning roll next, he'd give them riches beyond their wildest dreams. But if they lost, they'd become a part of his collection. They, of course, took the risk and wound up losing. The Collector was ecstatic, but the two aliens begged for a second chance for anything else they could give Tavon in place of themselves. After finding out what skilled fighters the Mugulons were, having an innate ability to fire bolts of plasma from their fingers, as well as having incredible reflexes and agility, he made them a new deal. There were many beings across the galaxy that owed the Collector debts and refused to pay, and other creatures he wanted in his collection. If Cuppy and Muggs went to these beings and collected what he was owed, and gathered the other species he desired, they could win their freedom. The two accepted, took their ship, and headed off. They successfully collected a few debts before heading to Earth for a creature the Collector was desperate to have in his collection, a Clintar, more commonly referred to on Earth as a symbiote. Now, Venom and Spider-Man hadn't always seen eye to eye, but in the last few years, Eddie Brock and his symbiote ally had leaned more and more onto the heroic side of the hero-villain spectrum. While they were still more aggressive than Spidey liked, he was willing to admit they were fairly good protectors of the innocent. So, when a couple odd-looking aliens came to try kidnapping Venom, Spidey was more than willing to help protect his old rival. Battles with the aliens often ended in a stalemate. The Mugulons were never able to defeat Spidey and Venom, but they were also consistently able to evade capture themselves. And so their attempts went on. Cuppy and Muggs continued trying to capture Venom, and Spidey and Eddie continued trying to capture them back. All the while, the clock was ticking for the two little aliens to repay their debt to the Collector, or be imprisoned themselves forever.
I always really love working with Spider-Man villains. I mean, I guess in this case I wasn't working with Spider-Man villains, I was turning things into Spider-Man villains, but you get what I mean, it's always fun. I know Spider-Man characters and Spider-Man lore well enough that I never really have to do much research to write villains for him, so I can just let the creativity fly right away. And it was nice working with some characters I hadn't used before. I'm definitely thinking of doing a full Poppy's Playtime kind of episode, and now that there's new DLC for Cuphead coming out, maybe I should do a full Cuphead episode at some point. But anyway, if you're new to the channel and you want more Spider-Man stuff, I recently did Spider-Man villains if they were dragons, and I think that's one of my better dragon episodes. Or if you want more video game stuff, I recently did Hollow Knight if it was a horror story. That's one of my better episodes too. Man, I feel like I'm crushing it this month with my episodes. And I guess I'm getting less humble. But anyway, besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending the video on a positive or uplifting note. And the thing I want to leave people with today is just the idea that all is well. Anytime I feel myself even just getting a little bit stressed, I try to repeat to myself a whole bunch of times that all is well. I just try to remember that the only reason it seems bad now is because I can't see yet what good it does for me in the future. So if you're in some kind of difficult situation, try to see it through that mindset. But it's all eventually for your betterment. Can be hard sometimes, but I think it's really helpful. And I hope it was helpful to someone else out there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.